Well, welcome to round 18 of the Good Fight. Today we are launching into what we might call the final instructions or the last bits of this New Testament letter we call 2 Timothy. And there's a lot of details that we're going to dive in and around and take a look at over these last 3 times that we have to share together. And I hope it'll be encouraging and helpful for us as we kind of unearth what's there for us. And so today we're going to be in chapter 4, starting at verse 9 and reading down to the end of verse 15. So I'll go ahead and read that for us and then we'll kind of dive in. Paul writes to Timothy, "Do your best to come to me soon. For Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. Luke alone is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is very useful to me for ministry. Tychicus I have sent to Ephesus, and when you come, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas, also the books, and above all, the parchments. Alexander the coppersmith did me great harm. The Lord will repay him according to his deeds. Beware of him yourself, for he strongly opposed our message." Now, it's interesting that in this last section of the letter, Paul is now going to give some personal instructions to Timothy, some things that he hopes that Timothy will be able to do and to accomplish. He kind of lays out kind of what's presently happening in terms of the network of ministry that's happening. And the temptation for us, I think, as we read these kinds of final greetings at the end of these letters is to kind of skip over them or to skim past them quite quickly. And I think the temptation is there because it really doesn't kind of on the surface seem to be very helpful for us. It's not really for us, it's for them and for what was happening then. There doesn't really seem to be at least any immediate value around what's happening here for us today. But here's what I do think is helpful. It does give us some practical insight into the nature and the working of the early church, to the people and to the places that were a part of it. But not only that, I think particularly what we're going to see is that it reminds us that God works through the everyday and the ordinary things to accomplish his purpose. It's through the everyday and ordinary actions of people that God is at work to do as he pleases. And so we begin with Paul asking Timothy, "Do your best to come to me soon." This is a request now that Paul says to Timothy, hey, if you can get here to visit me, to see me face to face in prison, that would be so helpful. And the thing we have to remember is that in order to be able to do that, that would have involved probably some great risk to Timothy, because travel in those days was difficult, it was expensive, and it was also very dangerous. Now, what we recall from chapter 1 is Paul, in his introduction in the letter, said to Timothy, look, I remember the last time we were together when we parted ways, that there were tears shed. Like, it was an emotional goodbye, because we thought maybe we would never see each other again. But now here he's saying, if it's at all possible, Timothy, can you come to visit me in Rome and bring with you some things that are going to be helpful for me? And in fact, a little bit later on, he says, do your best to get here before winter, because those months are going to be settling in, and that's going to get a little bit harder for me if I don't have the resources I need. Now, he goes on to explain, hey, Timothy, if you can get here, here's the reason why I'm asking you to make a personal visit. He says, Demas, who was with me, but is in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. In other words, Demas, who was with me, who is a support to me and a help to me, is no longer here. And we don't know exactly why, just that he's in love with this present world, whether that's because of his pursuit of wealth, maybe he had some personal interests that he wanted to take care of. Whatever the reason, he's essentially flaked out and deserted Paul. Maybe he's even ashamed, perhaps, of Paul's imprisonment. And so Demas has kind of left the scene. He, who was once a partner and missionary companion, is no longer there. And so Paul does not have the support of Demas. As well, Crescens has gone to Galatia. Now, church tradition says that he actually planted a church in Galatia and had a lot to do with the work there. And so Crescens is not with Paul. And Titus has gone to Dalmatia. Dalmatia. Now, Titus was again in Greek, a non-Jewish missionary, and he has gone off doing another work in another part of the world in Dalmatia. And Paul simply says, Luke alone is with me. Now, Luke is the physician, the missionary companion of Paul, who wrote the Gospel of Luke as well as the New Testament letter we call Acts, or the Acts of the Apostles. And a lot of the content that we read about in the book of Acts actually comes as a first-hand witness account of Luke as he sees the early church grow, and he follows Paul through the various cities in which he did his missionary work. And so he kind of is a chronicler or a historian of the movement of the early church, particularly as it relates to the ministry of Paul to a non-Jewish world. And so Luke, who's been traveling with Paul, is now still with Paul, but he's the only one that Paul has. He even says, Tychicus I have sent to Ephesus. Now, Tychicus was an emissary. He was a letter carrier. He was well loved. He was faithful. But he's also now not available to Paul. And that's why he's asking Timothy, can you come to me soon? And when you come, he says in verse 13, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas, and also the books, and above all, the parchments. Now, again, because winter is setting in, Paul's requesting that this cloak be brought to him, which was a coat made of thick wool that would have given him warmth through the winter months, which would have been very useful to Paul. But he also says, grab the bag. That is the bag of books that I left with Carpus. Now, Carpus was likely a friend of Paul's. He perhaps stayed with Carpus when he was in Troas. He left some things there with him. Carpus has been taking care of them and making sure that they're safe. And as Timothy comes, he says, if you could just stop by and grab that bag of books for me, that would be helpful. Now, these books are not fiction for Paul to simply pass the time with. They're most likely reference books. Remember, Paul, the student, he's still studying. But as well, above all of that, if nothing else, bring the parchments, which are likely the important notes from his own study. And so Carpus even has had a role to play in his support and ministry of Paul. Now, the thing that I want us to see here is that everybody in this list and as part of this discussion, except for one, is essentially on assignment. They have something to do. They have a role to play. It's not always glamorous. It's carrying a letter. It's holding books. It is, planting a church. There's all kinds of things that everybody in this list are up to. And even in the midst of it, we know that there are failures and there have been disagreements as well. I mean, you think even of John Mark, who is the cousin of Barnabas. If you remember early on in the book of Acts, he kind of gave up on the missionary journey and went home partway through. And the next time they set out, Paul says, I don't want to take him with me. He flaked out before. I don't know if I can trust him. And Barnabas is trying to plead the case. No, we need to take Timothy. He's good for it, I promise you. And they end up parting and going in different directions as a result. But here we see somewhere along the line, there's been a reconciliation in that relationship where Mark, who was not useful to Paul at one point, is now very useful to Paul for ministry. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is very useful to me. So Timothy, if you can come for this visit and bring the resources I need, bring Mark too, because he will also be helpful. And so through all the failures and disagreements and places and assignments, everybody has a role to play. And Paul, at the end of his life now, is still learning. Bring the books, bring the parchments. I'm not kind of coasting into the end of my life, just waiting for it to happen. I'm still learning. I'm still growing. I'm still, doing my best to understand the mysteries of God in my old age and with my death being so soon. But then he says a warning. He gives a warning to Timothy. He says, Alexander the coppersmith did me great harm. The Lord will repay him according to his deeds. But beware of him yourself, for he strongly opposed our message. We have this other character, Alexander, who is possibly the same Alexander that Paul expelled from the church for blasphemy. This is back in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 19 to 20. We have a reference to that. If it's the same Alexander that was expelled from the church, you've got to recall that action would have always been toward restoration, but it ends up that Alexander did great harm to Paul. And we're not told exactly what that great harm was. But we do know that Paul's attitude toward that wasn't, here's a way, could you get him back for me? Or I'm plotting some kind of revenge. He simply says, I know the Lord will repay him for what he did. But Timothy, you just got to be aware. I don't know how much more damage he's looking to inflict. And so be on your guard. Be aware of Alexander. And the thing that I love about this section is simply this, that there's a lot of people listed here that we don't know a lot about. But they were people who were very important to Paul and to the church. And there are common actions that as these people are on assignment, that they're doing the work they've been given. They're church planters, a physician, a chronicler, a historian, a friend, a letter carrier, somebody providing hospitality in the everyday and common things. There is incredible value. So we ought not to despise the little things. In fact, with the assignment that we've been given, we should always carry with us this attitude of, how can I help? How can I be useful to someone else and to the cause of Christ?